Hey everyone, was Jason Arday in effect lynched?
But I am so angry. I'm angry at the racism that surrounded Jason. I'm angry at the relentlessness with which he was watched, pursued, written about. Angry at how easily a human life can disappear beneath the weight of other people's words. Because Jason was here before the headlines, he was loved beyond them, he was known beyond them, and his life will remain infinitely larger than the story anyone tried to make of him. Racism did this, and I think we should be able to say that plainly this afternoon.
Hey everyone, I'm Rich Lowry of National Review, and of course, Jason Arday was the former Cambridge academic who took his own life tragically the other day after being accused credibly of plagiarism and fabulism. Terrible tragedy, but was it racism, as that Cambridge student was suggesting right there at a vigil, or in effect a lynching, as Ibram X. Kendi insists? Here's a headline from a piece he just wrote. This was a piece in something called The Emancipator. The media lynched Jason Arday. All right, so I think that's preposterous. The idea that this case had anything to do with racism or constituted a lynching. In fact, it's the opposite. It was the DEI regime that set up Jason Arday for this terrible fall, and I'm going to demonstrate why that is so in this video. First, I want to go back to this Kendi piece, Ibram Kendi, a little background on him really quick. Very prominent when Black Lives Matter movement was at its height after the death of George Floyd, wrote a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. Every corporation in the country wanted him to come speak to them, to devise trainings for them. Huge celebrity. He had a fall of his own, nothing like Arday's. He's not a plagiarist. We'll get into that a little bit more as well. But first, let's delve into this piece and this argument. To be a prominent anti-racist Black scholar is to know you are a target, almost totally surrounded by resentments. Prominence is relative. You can be prominent at your university, in your field, in your local community, in your nation, across oceans. As a prominent Black scholar, you know the attacks haunt and hunt you like a lynch mob. So let's pause right there, okay? Because being criticized is not like being pursued by a lynch mob at all, right? If you're a prominent academic, if you're a prominent opinion writer, if you're a prominent TV host, people are going to criticize you. A prominent politician, obviously, none of those people are in danger of being lynched or experiencing anything like lynching, which involves a mob literally hunting you down and dragging you out of your home or out of jail maybe and stringing you up by a tree. A horrific act of racial murder, which is a totally different category than what Kendi is talking about. And being a Black academic does not necessarily inherently mean you're being hunted down by malevolent critics. There are plenty of prominent Black academics in this country that are respected by both sides. I don't agree with pretty much anything Cornel West says, but there's no doubt he is a serious and compelling figure. Henry Louis Gates, John McWhorter, by the way, who's been really critical of Jason Arday and his defenders in this case, Thomas Sowell, on and on. But here is more from Kendi. All right, I'm going to skip through this litany a little bit. The attacks are wielded by racist propagandists resenting you for shining a light on anti-Black racism. The attacks come from centrist and progressive white scholars and writers resenting your positions and honors and pay. The attacks come from Black scholars and writers resenting your prominence, treating you as a competitor. The attacks come from social media users across ideologies who see that attacking you is trending on the algorithms. The university that propped you up for years now abandons you amid all the attacks. The white-owned mainstream media doesn't investigate the problem. Those attackers bent on your downfall, believing as you fall, they will rise. This argument is very Kendi in that it does not allow for any good faith disagreement with the so-called anti-racist worldview. White critics on the right who are critical of anti-racist scholars driven by racial resentments, white critics in the center driven by rejection of their worldview and ultimately resentment as well. Black critics are jealous and envious of their success, and on and on. So no one who criticizes people espousing this worldview have any legitimacy, according to Kendi. And through his insistence that everyone inevitably is going to attack these academics, he's saying, in effect, that no one should, that there's no possibility for good faith disagreement. And this is a deeply illiberal view meant to shut down debate. More from Kendi. He says the white-owned mainstream media circulates these attacks, then cites these figures. The white-owned mainstream media published 249 articles in 22 days on Jason Arday. By comparison, in 2024, and the weeks after the then newly released Epstein files showed long-standing ties between Epstein and Peter Mandelson, the UK media mentioned Mandelson 119 times. And in 2023, only the Financial Times covered extensively that William O'Reilly, a white Cambridge professor, was found guilty of plagiarism. So let's, for the sake of argument, accept those figures. I don't know whether they're correct or not, but why would the Arday case get more attention than other controversies and cases? Because he was incredibly famous. Because fundamentally, what Cambridge University did, hiring him in the first place and then holding him up as a shining, inspiring example of diversity and inclusion at this storied institution. And so much of the media, Kendi talks about how hostile the media is to Black scholars, but the BBC and others love this story and played up Arday as well. So he's made into this gigantic figure. Now, Kendi mentions this guy, William O'Reilly, that no one's ever heard of at Cambridge, who's accused of plagiarism, and there's maybe one story on his case. Yeah, because he wasn't famous, and apparently Cambridge concluded that his plagiarism was genuinely accidental, where with Arday, we were dealing with a whole different level of problem here. But again, it goes back to Cambridge hiring someone who is unqualified and blowing past all the blinking red lights about this guy. The New York Times, of all places, had a really good story on Cambridge decision making here. Let's quote a little bit from that. The New York Times recounts his search that landed on Arday. Cambridge's requirements, reviewed by the New York Times, called for an outstanding research record of international stature and a proven successful track record supervising PhD students. Dr. Arday had a modest publication record and had bounced from one university to the next, not staying long enough to oversee a full 3-year or more doctorate. Now, what made Arday so alluring to Cambridge, besides the fact that he was young and African American, is he had this incredible personal story of triumph over adversity and amazing achievements outside the classroom, supposedly running 30 marathons in 35 days, overcoming these horrible medical problems. He had a brain tumor removed, supposedly just a couple of weeks before he was defending his dissertation, and had to relearn all the material and on and on. But Cambridge should have known that this all was a crock. Arday had a couple different stories about his autism. In one story, he was in a special needs school. In another, he was in a regular classroom but sequestered alone. Here's the Times. Both tales are false, according to people who knew Arday as a child and spoke with the Times before his death. A speech professional who worked closely with young Arday recalled him having a language delay but speaking with both children and adults. One former schoolmate, Jonathan Stewart, recalled Arday cracking jokes and putting on playful accents in a minivan on the way to church activities as children. While nonverbal children can certainly learn to speak, even at a late age, the rapid development described by Arday has no precedent in clinical literature, 3 experts on autism and speech said. Then the Times story continues. Experts said that Cambridge's hiring panel was well equipped to question Arday's very public claims about his childhood. Some committee members had published papers about teaching students with learning disabilities and about inclusion in education. One influential member of the hiring panel, a child psychiatrist, had published a paper on music therapy for children with autism. Given his expertise, he would have been in a position to question Arday's assertion that he learned to speak at 11 and read at 18, said Howard Shane, the director emeritus of the Center of Communication Enhancement at Boston Children's Hospital. So Cambridge hires him when it shouldn't, when he's totally unsuited for this position, and immediately there are questions about him and his work that Cambridge waves off. Cambridge says there are incidents of vile racism, people raising these concerns about Arday. Arday himself hires aggressive law firms to scare journalists off writing stories about his plagiarism, calls the police to sick them on critics who are asking him about the plagiarism. So here you have Cambridge that's hired him when it shouldn't, promoted him when it shouldn't, and then deflects and defends him when it shouldn't. So it is creating this incredibly precarious perch for this guy when his academic work and his life story are eventually going to be exposed. You can't hide this kind of thing forever. Sure enough, it is exposed, and this tragedy results. Now, it's possible to imagine an alternate history here. Now, Arday, as a plagiarist, was not suited for academic work at all. But just let's hypothetically, let's say, he got his doctorate from a place called Liverpool John Moores University, which is a long way from Cambridge, a place no one has heard of, is the equivalent in the US of kind of a junior college. Let's say he just stayed there as a professor. No one would have cared about him, right? Maybe he would have been exposed eventually, but it wouldn't have been a big story because that's a place that doesn't matter. And he wouldn't have mattered so much, but it was Cambridge that went and plucked him from what should have been his obscurity into this incredibly prominent role. Now let's go back to Kendi. I've seen other prominent black scholars face these attacks time and again, and if you die from all the attacks, the media still calls the attacks on you accusations to wash their hands of the blood. Your lynchers announce your death as if they had no role in your lynching. But you know what your lynchers won't announce? When you're cleared of wrongdoing. We won't be seeing a media pile-on for that news on Jason Arday or other prominent black scholars. Now, a lot of problems packed into this couple of sentences there, but one of them is the assumption that Arday was innocent, that he wasn't guilty of plagiarism, he wasn't guilty of fabulism, when there's no evidence whatsoever to support the most fantastical elements of his life story. And as the New York Times showed, he lied about his kind of foundational myth that he wasn't speaking until age 11. And as for the plagiarism, you can see it. It's on the printed page in black and white. And even if he wasn't copying others' work, he was still incredibly sloppy for someone who's supposed to be a top scholar in his field, hired by Cambridge University. There's a grammatical error in the title of his own dissertation. The weight Kendi puts on that word lynching, by the way, is very telling. He clearly considers it a word with kind of a magical quality. It's a substitute for persuasive argument. But again, if someone criticizes you with words, that's nothing like lynching. And there's no obligation on the part of everyone else to accept someone who's an academic fraud for fear of exposing him might cause him mental and psychological distress. That's just not how it works. And by the way, Kendi's own work goes to the real shoddiness of so-called anti-racist scholarship. His fundamental contention is that any policy that causes a racial disparity is racist by definition, literally. And he was cornered on this a couple of years ago on Ezra Klein's podcast at the New York Times. Klein, obviously a progressive journalist at the New York Times, and asked him about defunding the police. Because if you defund the police, it's well established, the effect will be more young black men will die in the streets. So defunding the police, therefore, by Kendi's own logic, should be considered a racist policy. But he won't say this. He wiggled out of it and will not even accept the own logic of his reductive definition of racism. In sum, though, with regard to Jason Arday, Cambridge University and everyone who played along with puffing up this guy undeservedly have a lot to answer for. Hey, by the way, comment, like, and subscribe. I promise you won't regret it. I'm Rich Lowry, over and out.